as Churchill says, there's sort of an iron curtain dividing Europe between East and West. In the West are our friends, in the East are not our friends. And so what we see is the beginning of a tension that will lead to a nuclear arms race, that will lead to a space race, and it will put us into some peripheral wars, and almost into World War III. Okay? It lasts 45 years, give or take. It ends after the 80s. Reagan and Gorbachev and others helped propel this ending. The Berlin Wall falls in '91. But the war itself is really the cause, because Truman frames a new foreign policy called containment. This old container has communism in it. Truman's feeling was, okay, communism is in these places, but if it spills into, at this point it was Greece and Turkey, Truman said, we will protect all three peoples from totalitarian rule. And so this Truman Doctrine in 1947 that specifically deals with Greece and Turkey sort of becomes our foreign policy moving forward. In essence, the justification for the Korean War in 1950. A year later, Truman's Secretary of State George Marshall has Congress spend $17 billion in what's called the Marshall Plan to economically rebuild Europe. Eastern Europe didn't want that money. For us, it was a small price to pay for the friendship and the democracy of the West. It gave us that stability, it gave us friendship, and it gave us democracy. The city of Berlin in 1949 sits within the borders of East Germany, and that's where Truman has the standoff in the Berlin airlift. In Asia in 1950, we fight the Korean War over the 38th parallel because of this same mindset. And throughout the 50s and 60s, we believe in something called the domino theory, where if one country falls, the others fall. In the early stages of the Cold War, guys, we were the only ones with the atomic bomb, and so we sort of held the hammer. But secrets were sold, and by the late 1940s, the Soviets had a bomb as well, and now we're the two superpowers of the world. We're in NATO, they have the Warsaw Pact. Collective security, it's like two big gangs, pick a side. We saw it as good versus evil. And in our own country, there were witch hunts trying to call out people that were Soviet sympathizers or worse, worked for the Soviet Union. In '49, when China fell to communism and scared us, luckily their friendship with the Soviet Union was never really too much. Thankfully, or together, they could have really caused us a lot of problems. Eisenhower's domino theory, in his dullest diplomacy of massive retaliation, was a little bit different than when Kennedy took office. He wanted more of a flexible response. But Kennedy gets us the closest we ever got to World War III with the Cuban Missile Crisis and our fear that the Soviets were going to launch nukes from Cuba 90 miles from Hawaii, or from Miami. And so after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was sort of had a sobering effect. We start to see some nuclear test ban treaties, a red phone put in the White House so that they can get a hold of the Kremlin immediately. But in 1965, Lyndon Johnson brings us into Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, to stop the domino theory in Southeast Asia. And that war becomes very unpopular. A lot of Americans are like, what are we doing there? By the time Nixon becomes president, he gets us out of Vietnam. The Soviets beat us into space, but we beat them to the moon. We're still locked in an arms race, but in the 1970s, there's SALT talks which limit arms. You get rid of 3, I get rid of 3. You get rid of 5, I get rid of 5. You get rid of 2 medium-length missiles, we get rid of 2 medium-length missiles. SALT 1 and SALT 2. Really good intentions. But by the late 1970s, it's clear that the Soviets aren't going to change their horrible ways as they invade Afghanistan, and we've got ourselves still the same problem. And where it doesn't look like there's a lot of good solutions until Reagan takes office. And then obviously Reagan's mindset's different. It's build up the military try to see if they can compete in an arms race, banking on the fact that the communist system can't mass produce like American capitalism. And ultimately, that, with a cooperating premier in Mikhail Gorbachev, is really what makes the Cold War end, or one of the large reasons of why it ends up ending. But we fight a couple of peripheral wars because of it. We almost have World War III. It's kind of a big deal. Any questions about the Cold War? Valerie?
So Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones by?
At the Yalta Conference.
Yalta Conference?
Yalta, which was a conference with FDR, Stalin, and Churchill.
How do you spell that?
YALTA.
And what were the 4?
The US, France, and Great Britain, and then the Soviets.
So mistakes made at Yalta, like?
Well, they should have never trusted that the Soviets would have free elections in the places that we allowed them to occupy.
And how do you spell that?
YALTA.
YALTA.
Yep.
And the Marshall Plan, Congress paid $17 billion to what?
Economically rebuild Western Europe, which was like a win-win. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the camera and then we'll talk about a different topic.
Where